Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming, although the problem with the trains. So we are very pleased to host here Lesley. Lesley is a first professor in Macquarie University for biology, but she also the vice chancellor for research. So it's great to have her here. Her background is mainly on climate change and the impact of climate change on ecosystems. So it's of course will be very interesting to hear her opinion on this one. Lesley has quite large experience in activities that it's outside the academia. So she led the ICPP work packages. She also was, I need to read that, Federal Climate Commissioner. Yeah. Mm-hmm. She's also the director of WWF Australia, and she also served as one of the leaders of the Climate Council in Australia. She also had a few other appointments. I hope that you will describe that. But as you understand, she is an expert in the area. She's going to speak with us. I'm sure that we will get quite a lot of interesting information about the activities in this area. So please join me and welcome Lesley. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you very much for having me here, and thank you to Ziv and to Oliver for inviting me. The talk that I'm going to give, I actually developed it, this is the second time I've delivered a similar talk. I developed it to originally deliver in the Chief Scientist of New South Wales seminar series at Parliament House. So quite a bit of it is, as you will see, somewhat directed towards politicians who were quite prominent in the audience at that talk. But what I really want to talk about is not so much, I'm not going to give you a climate change lecture by any means, and I'm certainly not an expert in the engineering space, but I do hope that those of you that are from this department will, at the end of this talk, actually be even more motivated to keep doing what you do, because this talk is really at least partly about why what you do is actually so important. But I also want to deal with the role of scientists in particular as communicators in this space and in any sort of science space, and talk a little bit about the difficulties that arises through scientific communication, especially in relation to climate change, and what I have learnt over the last probably 15 years from many experiences, both good and bad, in this area. So I want to begin with a little pop quiz. I did give this little quiz to the parliamentarians and nobody knew who this man was, but I'm hoping that somebody in this audience knows who this guy is. Anyone? Anyone? Hint, he's a scientist, just recently retired. Okay, his name, which you will have heard of, is James Hansen. Recently retired from 46 years at NASA. And in a sense, I'm starting with Jim Hansen because his personal journey over the last 50 or so years of his professional life is somewhat emblematic of some of the themes that I want to touch on today. What James Hansen was doing here was testifying to Congress in 1988. Remember that date. And this is what he said. It is time to stop waffling so much and say that the evidence is pretty strong that the greenhouse effect is here. 1988. Apparently he left that congressional hearing thinking, well, done that, they'll all pay attention, they'll change their policies, everything will be fine, we won't have to worry so much about climate change impacts in the future. I'll come back to how he feels about that statement at the end of my talk. So this is what I want to cover. I want to very briefly do a sort of a brief history of what we knew about climate change and when we knew it, because I think there are some powerful lessons in that. Why we should care. I'm sure I don't need to convince most of you as to why we should care, but I will give some examples. Then I want to talk about why the message of climate change and what we need to do about it is often very difficult to deliver, to get action. And then talk about how we as scientists or members of the community, engineers, professionals in this space, how we should and can respond. So I want to go back, the slides are a little bit further that way, to Jean-Baptiste Fourier. Those of you who are physicists will, of course, recognise the surname Fourier, Fourier transform, Fourier law, etc. An extraordinary genius, a polymath, a true Renaissance man. Amongst other things, happened to be the governor of Egypt for a while, was jailed by Napoleon for his views, all sorts of things. But along the way, he found time to wonder about the temperature of the Earth, and he realised that a rock about the size of the Earth at that particular distance from the sun, which had been well measured by then, should actually be a lot colder than it really was. And he surmised from that that the fact that it wasn't 33 degrees colder than it was on average meant that there must be some sort of insulative layer around the Earth. He didn't call it the greenhouse effect at the time, but he described it in theoretical terms because it had to be there. Incredible foresight, and he published his paper in French in 1824. So really that's the start of knowledge about the greenhouse effect. An Irish physicist, John Tyndall, is generally credited, or was at least, credited to discovering and experimenting on the heat trapping properties of different gases and publishing that work in 1859. He was an extraordinary experimentalist. He built that spectroscope down there to do the measurements. He also didn't call it the greenhouse effect at that time, but he did show what the relative heat trapping properties of different gases were. Now, John Tyndall published that in 1859. 2 years ago it was discovered that he'd actually been pipped to the post by 3 years by this woman, Eunice Newton Foote, who in 1856 had done some experiments, empirical experiments measuring the heat trapping properties of different gases, and had her work presented at a conference of the American Academy of Sciences, unfortunately not by Eunice herself but by a man, because she was not allowed to present at that conference. And that was in 1856. So in fact, Eunice Newton Foote pipped John Tyndall to the post by 3 years, and that was really only discovered a few years ago when the transcripts of that conference came to light. But she said the highest effects of the sun's rays I have found to be in carbonic acid gas, and that's what CO2 used to be known as. Then there's a series of more men, I'm afraid, who added to that knowledge and built upon it. Arvid Högbohm, Swede, was the first to quantify the sources from human sources of CO2 versus natural sources and describe and understand the carbon cycle. Svante Arrhenius, who was also a Swede, brilliant chemist, actually realised that what Högbohm had calculated meant that he could calculate how much warming was associated with how much increased greenhouse gas, and actually got it pretty close. He said 2 times CO2 would lead to a warming of around about 5 to 6 degrees. He predicted that the Earth would warm in time, though thought it would take many, many thousands of years, and actually thought it wouldn't be a bad thing because it might put off the next ice age. So Arrhenius, of course, couldn't have anticipated the acceleration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases because he didn't really understand what would happen with the Industrial Revolution. So we can forgive him for that. Guy Callendar, an American, and that's his original hand-drawn graph there. In those days you had to hand-draw your graphs for journal publications. He actually came up with the idea of the greenhouse effect, but it was actually at the time called the Callendar effect. And he also thought that this would actually be a good thing, delaying the return of deadly glaciers. But he was really the first one to take empirical observations of both CO2 and the temperature of the Earth, correlate the two and draw the connection to provide the first empirical observations of what had up until that moment simply been theory. I have to mention, of course, Charles Keeling, who I'm sure you all know, invented, not really invented, but gave rise to the Keeling curve because he put into place the apparatus for measuring CO2 on an ongoing basis at Mauna Loa in Hawaii, and those measurements still go on today. The first actual scientific mention of the words global warming was actually, we think, in this paper published in Science in 1975. And this guy, Wallace Broker, is still around and still writing, and he published something not so long ago to indicate that he actually got some of the calculations wrong in 1975, and he was hastening to correct the record, which was interesting. But he's really, we think, responsible for the term global warming. But since that time, scientists and engineers and others have been very busy. So I just did these estimations using Web of Science with the terms global warming or climate change. And there's been a cumulative number of 294,000 odd papers published since the early 1980s. So there's been a tremendous amount of activity. There shows no slackening in the publications. It continues to rise exponentially. So it's just as well, Ziv mentioned that I've been involved in the IPCC. I didn't lead it. I was a lead author, but that's just a designation. There are many, many hundreds of those, if not thousands. The IPCC was set up by the UN and the World Meteorological Organization to get a handle on synthesising the growing amount of information about climate change being produced by scientists and others. And I want to very quickly pick out a single sentence or two from each of the IPCC reports to illustrate to you how our confidence has changed over time about the connection between greenhouse gases and what's happening to the climate. So the very first assessment report in 1990 did say that the warming was about somewhere between 0.3 and 0.6 degrees, and noted that emissions from human activities were growing substantially, but didn't link the two together. Maybe implied it, but wasn't actually explicit about it. The second report in 1995 is getting a little bit more bold by saying, well, it's unlikely to be entirely, the warming that is unlikely to be entirely natural in origin, pointing towards a human influence on the climate. By the third assessment report, people were getting a little bit bolder. There's new and strong evidence that most of the warming in the last 5 decades or so can be attributed to human activities. By the fourth one, and that's when I got involved in this, some stronger language. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal, very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. And then the last report, the fifth assessment report, once again that word unequivocal used again, words like unprecedented. And this very important sentence, human influence on the climate system is clear. It is extremely likely, 95 to 100% probability that those two things are connected. So over the period of those decades, the language of science and the accumulation of evidence has increased dramatically. I should say also that the IPCC reports, I would think, are the most highly scrutinised reports in the history of human writing. So just the last one, the fifth one, 3 working groups, about 2,500 pages. They go through many drafts, about 800 authors, and each one of those drafts is reviewed, and every single one of those 142,000 odd comments is responded to in writing and in public. So I cannot think of any other publication in history that is so vigorously scrutinised. So that's a little bit about the history, but so why should we care? Well, I want to use I'm going to use a few A words in this talk. People like me, and no doubt some of you in the audience that are out there in the public talking about climate change, are often accused of being this, alarmist. the definition of alarmist is someone who exaggerates a danger and so causes needless worry or panic. I absolutely maintain that we are not being alarmist. What we talk about is alarming, but we are, I'm afraid, unfortunately, not exaggerating. Here's one way of looking at it. If we go back to the times of ancient Egypt and then fast forward about 7,000 years to the 1970s, apart from an obvious decline in men's fashion over that period, other things have been happening. If we then take from the 70s to 2016, a period of about 40 years, and we compare the changes in climate over those two periods, 7,000 years versus the last 40 years, we find that the climate has been changing 170 times faster over the 40 years than it did in the previous 7,000. Some of you might have seen this little graphic. This shows a graphical version of the increase in global temperature going back to the mid-80s and forward to 2016, month by month, and the two red lines there are at 1.5 and 2 degrees embodied in the Paris climate target, but I think the graphic speaks for itself. We know that 2016 was the world record hottest year. It's just been announced about a few days ago actually that 2017 is now officially the third warmest year in history and the warmest El Nino year, and 16 of the 17 warmest years that we know have occurred since the year 2000. And this of course is wreaking havoc on the physical systems and the biological systems of the Earth. Such as these glaciers retreating. This is the Muir Glacier in North America, 1941, 1950 and 2004. Not only is this a shame for tourists and what we see, this has enormous consequences for global freshwater supplies. So this is the Hindu Kush Plateau on the Tibetan Plateau. It's the source of 10 major river systems, such as the Ganges, providing water for about a sixth of the world's population, a fifth to a sixth of the world's population. 500 glaciers in this region have already disappeared. And of course, glaciers are like frozen dams. They hold water and then they trickle it out to be used. Once the dam is gone, there is no storage for that water. Polar ice also melting, of course. This shows the Arctic ice comparing 1984 to 2016. So that purple line is the 1984 extent of summer ice. Sea level rise is accelerating. In fact, sea level rise has tripled in pace since the 1990s. That's just some new research out last year. And this, of course, is affecting all our coastlines, particularly in Australia. About half of our coastline is vulnerable to recession by the end of this century, given current rates. So this has all sorts of impacts, not just for gradual erosion, but for the impacts of coastal storms. Here's just a couple of examples of 1 in 100 year flood in Sydney under the present rate of sea level rise, which gives us about a metre of sea level rise compared to pre-industrial by the end of this century. That type of flooding event could occur every day by 2100. And that puts an awful lot of our assets at risk because most Australians live on the coast and most of our infrastructure is on the coast. Oceans have been doing a great service for the planet. They have absorbed about 93% of the extra heat that is being trapped in the Earth, and they're absorbing a considerable amount of the extra CO2 also, and that is changing their composition, and they are now around about 30% on average more acidic than in pre-industrial times. And this is already having measurable impacts on many marine organisms with thinner and more fragile shells. As I'm sure you're all aware, coral reefs have been bleaching, and probably, unfortunately, the best example of this is on the Great Barrier Reef. That picture was taken at Heron Island last year. We've had 2 catastrophic bleaching events in 2016 and 2017, globally as well as on the Great Barrier Reef. On the GBR, about 93% of individual reefs showed some degree of bleaching, and surveys since that time have shown that about 50% of the coral that did bleach has now died. Unfortunately, we may get a 3rd unprecedented year of bleaching because there is already some indications at places like Heron Island of bleaching this year as well. Of course, this isn't just bad for biodiversity, it's bad for the Australian economy, and I'll come back to this economic versus environment question a bit later on. The reef alone brings in about $7 billion to the Australian economy and directly and indirectly employs over 60,000 people. Heat waves. We're getting heat waves more and more. We've got a sort of a mini heat wave, I suppose, in Sydney again this weekend. But they can be absolutely lethal. In Europe, 2003, there was a 3-week heat wave. Temperatures reached up to 12 degrees above normal temperatures at that time of the year. 70,000 premature deaths are estimated to have occurred, particularly in France and Germany. A few years later in Russia, 56,000 premature deaths are also associated with an extended heat wave. Now here in Australia, fortunately, we haven't seen those sorts of catastrophic events, but the impact of heat waves is somewhat underappreciated. So for example, Black Saturday in Victoria in 2009, I think we all remember that if we were living in Australia, there were 173 deaths on that 9th of February 2009. What is less appreciated is that there were double that number of people that died prematurely in the week before Black Saturday as a result of heat-related causes, because there was a heat wave that went right across southeast Australia. Heat waves don't leave the sort of catastrophic scars on the landscape that fires do, so we do tend to underappreciate their impacts on human health. Going back up into the Northern Hemisphere then, we know that things like extreme storms, hurricanes, they're called tropical cyclones here, hurricanes in the Northern Hemisphere, they're the same thing, have been increasing. This is the annual frequency of North Atlantic tropical storms, a 10-year running average, and I think the data is pretty self-explanatory. And of course this has these sorts of extreme events have extraordinary impacts on people. So between 2007 and 2016, there was nearly a 50% increase in weather-related disasters. In 2015 alone, 19 million people displaced as a result of those disasters. So now we reach a thing called a tipping point. Well, at least we don't know where the tipping points are for most things. We've got a pretty good idea for the Great Barrier Reef, but not very good ideas for most other things. But it's a really, really important concept in the climate change area. So it can be defined as the point at which a series of previously quite small or incremental changes suddenly collectively become significant enough to cause a very large change. And the thing about climate change is, for most tipping points, we don't know if we've passed them, we don't know where they will be in the future. But that doesn't stop scientists from at least predicting changes that might be associated with tipping points at different levels of temperature. So let me just give you a few of those. So looking ahead, 1 to 3 degrees, we've already had 1 degree. Relative to pre-industrial times. If we're looking ahead to 3 degrees, and I can talk about the Paris Climate Agreement a little bit later on, the sort of things we might anticipate. Loss of most of the world's coral reefs by 3 degrees. Loss of Arctic summer ice by that time. Considerable melting on the West Antarctic ice shelf, and loss of most of the world's glaciers. Between 3 and 5 degrees then, looking down the barrel, enormously increased extinction rates for our species, potentially the loss of at least 1 in 6 species and probably more. The conversion of the Amazon rainforest to savanna and the loss of the carbon sink that rainforest represents, and enormous changes in the direction and speed of ocean currents. Looking forward then to the 4 degrees. 4 degrees would result in submergence of land that's currently occupied by somewhere between 470 and 760 million people. Some of those countries, like Tuvalu, like Kiribati, like the Marshall Islands, that are really in our own backyard, disappear a long way before that. The Maldives, only 2.4 metres above sea level. And then places like the Ganges megadelta in Bangladesh, where millions upon millions of people live, will be underwater at 4 degrees. Beyond 5 degrees, which in lots of ways doesn't really bear thinking about, ongoing loss of polar ice, pretty spectacular loss of polar ice, and enormous release of both of carbon dioxide and methane from melting in the tundra. That of course is going on already, but it would be spectacularly accelerated by that period. Some of you may have heard of this guy, John Schellenhuber. He's actually one of the world's most respected and well-known climate scientists, though isn't in the public eye very much in Australia. He's German. He came up with, for example, the 2-degree guardrail figure that subsequently was embodied in the UNFCCC. When John Schellenhuber was here a few years ago for a conference, he was asked by a journalist, because the conference was about, okay, what will Australia be like at 4 degrees? And a journalist said, well, what's the difference between a 2-degree world and a 4-degree world? And his answer was extremely succinct. It was this: human civilization. Schellenhuber basically said, human civilization as we know it, he cannot envisage that beyond 4 degrees. So this is the question then: what are our chances in the future, our children and our grandchildren's chances? Well, this is when a really important concept, which has been explained and used a lot more in recent times, becomes very useful. The carbon budget, which is basically the quantity of greenhouse gases that can be emitted in total over a particular time period for a specified amount of warming. The best carbon budget figures that we have, the most recent ones that are most detailed, were produced in 2015, and this is what they show. To maintain temperatures at or below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and in 2015 was estimated that we'd already spent 71% of that budget, and we had about 20 years of emissions left at that rate of emissions. To stay beneath the 1.5 degrees, it was estimated that 95% of our emissions have already been spent, and there were 3 years left. Well, 3 plus 2015, you can do the math. 2018 is kind of critical year. 20 years left for 2 degrees, only 3 years left at that time for 1.5. Which leads to, of course, another almost blindingly obvious fact, that most of the world's fossil fuel reserves, especially coal, in order for us to have any chance of staying within that budget, must be left in the ground, unmined and unburnt. And the figure for Australia's known extractable coal reserves is about 90%. It's about the global average also. A few years ago, or about a year ago, it was looking like emissions had levelled off. If you have a look at those little dots there, the fourth, third and second last dot looked like emissions were levelling off despite ongoing global economic growth. And people were getting, kind of excited about that maybe we had peaked. Unfortunately, last year, emissions grew 2%. So clearly we hadn't peaked. We are still increasing. We'll have to wait and see what happens this year. The UN produced late last year a thing called the Emissions Gap Report, where they estimated where emissions were going as opposed to where emissions needed to go to keep temperatures to certain levels. They noted that CO2 was higher than at any time in at least the last 5 million years. The last time CO2 was this high, sea levels were about 20 metres higher than they are at present, and that indicates that time lag between emissions, melting of polar ice and subsequent impacts on sea level, and that global temperatures at that time were about 2 to 3 degrees warmer than they are today. They then estimated, by adding up all of the pledges of different countries to the Paris Climate Agreement, where we were and where we needed to be. And they estimated that even if all of those pledges are met 100% on time, we're only about a third of where we need to be to actually meet the Paris climate target of keeping temperatures below 2 degrees. That's quite a big gap. Now here in Australia, we were doing quite well. If you just look at the red line is Australian emissions going through from June 2011 to June 2015. And let me point out two things. That was when the carbon price was imposed by the Gillard government. That was when the carbon price was repealed by the Abbott government, and I think the data speaks for itself. And in fact, since the carbon price was repealed here, Australian emissions have risen and have risen in every single quarter. The government tends to release this data usually 1 or 2 days before Christmas. That's what they did last year and the year before, in the hope that nobody will notice it. Of course, lots of people do notice it and get stuck into them. But Australian emissions continue to rise. Australia's commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement was for a 26 to 28% reduction on 2005 levels, which was a particularly high year for emissions, so that's why they've chosen that figure, by 2030. The government's own Climate Change Authority, their advisory body, had previously recommended a far stronger target of a 40 to 60% reduction. Australia's commitment is generally regarded as inadequate, though we are not the only country with an inadequate target. But more importantly, an independent body called Climate Action Tracker has estimated that we're actually on track to increase our emissions by about 27% rather than reduce them by that by 2030. And in fact, singles out Australia as having the biggest gap between what we have pledged and what we might potentially achieve based on current trajectories. Now I realise you can't read this graph, this table, but I'll explain what it is first and then I'll show you where we are. Another independent UN organisation, Climate Watch, every year looks at emissions of each of the 58 top emitters and their climate policies, and it ranks people, ranks countries, accordingly. Australia is there. We're 5th last. We've come up 2 places because the last 5 years or so we've been 3rd last, just ahead of Kazakhstan and Saudi Arabia. Korea and Japan, for some reason, have now slipped below us, but still we are 5th out of 58 in terms of good climate policy. Which brings me to this part of the talk. Well, why, given some of the data that I've shown you and all the sorts of evidence around us of impending catastrophe, why is it still so hard for people like me, people like you, to get this message out? Well, I think it's actually quite understandable, why it's so hard. I've been thinking about this a lot. And there's a lot of psychology research on this, but I'm going to just talk about my own sort of lived experience in talking to probably thousands of people over the last 15 years or so about how they feel about climate change. And this is my take on it. Firstly, it's very complicated. Scientists like me love these sorts of graphs. We use them in our work, we show them, we understand them, at least most of the time, and we think they're very compelling. But for people who are not scientists, those sorts of two-dimensional representations of data are actually pretty complicated and can really turn people off. And you see people's eyes glaze over even as you watch. So it's very complicated. Scientists, being cautious folk, also use words like this. It could, it might, there's probability, there's some uncertainty, and even notwithstanding the increasingly strong and certain language from the IPCC, we still use lots of qualifiers. And of course, this gives a lot of people an excuse not to really pay much attention. It's pretty scary. Most people in the public don't want to think about scary things all the time. I don't. Why should they? It's pretty sad to think about loss. It's like not wanting to think about yours or your loved one's deaths all the time. We can't live if we continually focus on the negative. This is an important one. Climate change is often still portrayed, especially by politicians, as only an environmental problem. Now, clearly it is an environmental problem, but I've just shown you a few instances of why it is far, far more than just an environmental problem for things like polar bears. It's an economic problem, it's a health problem, it's a social problem, it's a security problem. Only presenting it all the time as an environmental problem is part of the communication difficulty. It can also seem like a long way off. You know, we get up, we go to work, we come home, the world didn't end. Pictures like that just seem like in the realm of science fiction. It's not going to really happen to me. I can afford to ignore it. Or it can seem to be mainly happening to someone else. Yes, we all care about Syrian refugees, for example, but they don't tend to impinge on our everyday lives. It's easy to ignore that. The other problem, of course, is that in these days of the desire for instant gratification, even if we stopped the tap of greenhouse gases tomorrow, the tap of climate change would continue to run for decades to come. The lag time in the climate system is part of our communication problem. People want to be able to turn off a light and see an impact, and it just doesn't work like that. And there are lots of still very powerful, rich, loud, aggressive voices arrayed against the message for whatever ideological or personal financial reason. And while the media has improved enormously, I've seen it improve enormously in the last 10 years. Most media organisations now don't insist on having a balanced view on climate change, but nonetheless there are still some influential media outlets, including our national broadsheet, that continues to focus on what is a false debate. And of course there are very other immediate, legitimate, important concerns, be it local, our health, educating our children, or more global, you know, what will Kim Jong-un actually do tomorrow? And those are really legitimate things to worry about, and they tend to crowd the climate change concerns out of the picture. And really climate change is the absolute classic tragedy of the commons problem, really like no other. The Earth system is a common resource. We all contribute to it. The solution, while we can tackle it locally, has ultimately got to be a global one. But the good news is that actually the Australian community on the whole is very much on board with climate action and climate change awareness. So this was one of the last hurrahs, this survey by the Climate Institute before it folded up last year, where they had repeated their annual survey, this time of about 2,500 Australians, as to their attitudes to climate change. So here's some of their results. 71% accepted that the climate was actually taking place. 66% were concerned. 87% didn't want Australia to step and resile back from the agreements in Paris, with 61% wanting us to work harder with other countries to achieve the Paris objectives. 72% thinks that governments should implement a plan for an orderly closure of coal-fired power stations and replace them with clean energy. And this be especially of interest to the people that work in this building. 96% of Australians want our primary source of energy to come from renewables. That's all good. So as scientists, how can we respond to all of this? Something that I spend much of my life thinking about. Sometimes it feels like this. On the one side of this tightrope, there's all the gloom and doom stuff, some of which I have shared with you today. And we have to be honest about that. We cannot sugarcoat the risks. On the other side of the tightrope, however, is the fact that we know that only talking about catastrophe is very off-putting. It's likely to make your audience shut down and try to think about something else. So we have to balance that catastrophic information with the positive messages about what the future could and should be like. Balancing those two things is different for different groups of people, for different ages, for different audiences. Getting the balance right is really hard. One of my colleagues at the University of Queensland, John Cook, did a PhD where he looked at the difference between what scientists think about climate change and what the public thinks about scientists thinking about climate change. And he was actually the one whose PhD work came up with this 97% figure, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. That is that of the studies that he looked at, and he looked at many thousands over a particular period of time, 97% of them basically agreed with the premise that the activities of humans were changing the climate. Only 3% disagreed. So that was what the scientists were saying during that survey. But then what John did, which was important, was he also then surveyed the public to say, okay, what do you think about the scientific consensus? And the survey that he did found that only 45% of those surveyed thought that the scientists were in agreement. 55% thought that the science was still unsettled. And that difference in perception is really important, because we know from psychology research that you're much more likely to agree with something if you think everybody else agrees with it. So continuing to sort of deliver the message that there's uncertainty and disagreement in the scientific community actually lets people off the hook in taking it seriously. The best way that I can think of to illustrate this sort of thing is with this plane, and my apologies to Qantas, it could be any sort of plane. Scientists in the climate change area get pretty frustrated that they are held to a apparently completely different set of standards compared to other experts in other walks of life. So let me put this to you as a hypothesis. If you turned up at the airport to get on this plane and there were 100 aeronautical engineers standing around the plane, and 97 of those said, actually, we are reasonably confident, actually we're really confident, that this plane will crash on its next flight, who would get on that plane? Well, I dare say no one. And you certainly wouldn't take your family with you. Really, that's what we're talking about here. 97% of climate experts say this is happening. Why wouldn't people believe them when you would believe an aeronautical engineer? Even when there's 3 guys standing there going, actually, you know, I think it's fine, you know, planes fly, you know, should be fine. Scientists sometimes get asked how they feel about this sort of thing. And if you want to read about how a whole bunch of climate scientists actually feel about the issue, you can go to this website. It was an exhibition done by a student at ANU called Joe Duggan, who surveyed 40 climate scientists. I was one of those he surveyed, and he asked us not just what we thought, but he asked us to write a handwritten letter about our feelings about the issue and send it to him. And I dashed something off. All of those letters are on the website. I sort of wish I'd sort of taken a bit more time with mine, but anyway. And the sorts of adjectives that come out of those letters, if you do a quick survey, are things like this. They're pretty negative adjectives. There are also a minority of those 40, which actually use some sort of optimistic, hopeful sentences as well. So I've been talking to people about climate change. I've been researching climate change for about the last 25 years, and I've probably been pretty active in climate change communication, I suppose, increasingly over the last decade, 10 to 15 years. And so I just want to share the 5 main things that I've learnt over time. They're not rocket science, but to me they're meaningful. The first one is that just doing more of that is not enough if you really want to make a difference. Because we know now that more information does not necessarily lead to more understanding. And to take that a bit further, we also know that more understanding does not necessarily lead to more action. We could have 24 million Australians sitting on their couch saying, I'm really concerned about climate change, and if that's all they're doing, nothing will change. So to counter that, I think we need to continually look for better ways, more meaningful ways of delivering the climate change narrative. We can all care about polar bears, but they do not impinge on our daily life here. But caring about our children's health and our children's future is a much more immediate, direct and local, meaningful thing to talk about. Then there's this word, advocacy. I said I'd deal with a few A words. As scientists, we're often told that we can't be advocates, as if it's a really dirty word. And I've thought a lot about this word. When you look up the definition of advocacy, it's actually defined like this: public support for or recommendation of a particular cause or policy. Well, that doesn't seem too bad, does it? And over time, I've really decided that being an advocate for climate change communication and better policy is absolutely not a dirty word for me as a scientist. I'd like all scientists to be advocates using this definition. Here's our chief scientist. I think this is advocacy. This is newspaper heading last year. Alan Finkel supports Labor's 50% renewables target. You would have to say that is a sentence about advocacy. If the chief scientist can do it, I don't see why the rest of us can't. Fourthly, we need to, I mentioned that tightrope between positive and negative messages before, and really we do need to deliver the negative messages, to be honest, but we also need to try to overwhelm those negatives with honest positives as well. And of course, people working in this building have many stories along that line. And we do need to emphasise that these are not pie-in-the-sky things to aim for. These are achievable. I pulled this, the day before I put this talk together, I pulled this off the web. California now saying they're going to reach their 50% renewable target in 2020 instead of 2030, which was their original target. That's a tremendously positive message to give people. Not only can and should we do it, but it is actually doable. And my final thing is, and this is really something that I talk about a lot with my fellow academics, is we can't do this alone. It's not just up to scientists. And in fact, in my view, as a scientist, if I want to have impact, just writing more and more papers about research isn't going to do it. We have to work with other people. We have to work with a whole range of other people, psychologists, communicators, engineers, people in the street, everyone. And I want to just pay tribute now to 4 organisations with whom I work and or have worked that I think I have more impact through my role in these organisations than in anything that I have ever done in the laboratory or written up as a scientific paper. WWF Australia, Ziv mentioned I'm not the director, I'm a director, I'm on the board, has a fantastic range of programs including excellent climate change programs. The Wentworth Group, some of you may have heard of, an eccentric, lovable, crazy bunch dedicated to bringing science into environmental policy. The former Climate Commission, of which I was one of the 6 commissioners, put together by the Julia Gillard's government to be out there talking to the Australian public about climate change, abolished on the 2nd day of the Abbott government. That is our current Prime Minister up there at the back of one of our forums asking a question. And finally, the Climate Council, of which I am still a member of, it's now been going for 4.5 years. It sort of rose like a phoenix from the ashes of the abolished Climate Council. It is publicly funded and there is a huge, if you want information about climate change, especially in the Australian context, there is a huge resource there on the Climate Council website. So let me come back then to James Hansen. Here he was in 1988. This is James Hansen here in 2015 at the Paris climate meeting. He's obviously lost a bit of hair, or it's sort of been rearranged from the top of his head to his chin. And I think James Hansen was probably always a fairly dour individual. Well, he's a very grumpy old man now, let me tell you. And who can blame him? Because he really did think that the impact of his words to Congress all of those years ago would actually make a difference. And I'm assuming that he thinks it didn't make as big a difference as he would have liked. James Hansen, a couple of years ago, wrote a book. He's published hundreds of papers in climate science, but he wrote one called Storms of My Grandchildren. It's got a pretty clunky subtitle, The Truth About Coming Climate Catastrophe and Our Last Chance to Save Humanity. He's on the negative side of that tightrope that I spoke about before. But he really is a scientist that has gone from being a pretty straight climate scientist working for NASA, 46-year career, to understanding that a different narrative is necessary from him as a scientist. Here's James Hansen a couple of years ago, and yes, he is getting arrested. He's become an activist, so this is my last A word. Activists, in fact, are defined as this: a person who campaigns to bring about political or social change. Well, you know, frankly, I don't think that's a bad thing either. So I'm, by that definition, quite willing to say I'm not only an advocate, I'm also an activist. I'm probably not brave enough personally to get arrested for it, but you know, if somebody like James Hansen, with his experience and his knowledge of the climate system, is willing to do so, that should give us all pause. So finally, it's not just up to me and James Hansen and the people that are working in this as a career. There are some fantastic things that have happened. This is a picture here of, or several pictures of the People's Climate Marches that happened the week before the Paris Climate Summit. The one in New York was the single largest march in history. But here in Sydney, 50,000 people marched for climate action. And I want to leave you now with my favourite poster from these marches, because to me it's a very poignant message. It's a very important message. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We can't just sit around and wait for other people to solve the problem, because after all, we are all on this planet together. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to answer questions if we have some time. Zip, yeah. Yes.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting. Is there a useful role for institutions such as universities divesting, taking their own money, and divesting from fossil fuel?
Yes, I absolutely think that's the case. ANU, for example, I think last year or the year before, announced they would be divesting from fossil fuels, partly. And usually these divestment announcements are sort of partly. But I think universities have an extremely important role to play in leading action. If the best intellectual minds in the country can't collectively come together and do the right thing, well, why should we expect anybody else to? So absolutely, I mean, they should be going 100% solar, like your recent announcement, and they should be divesting. I'm frustrated at my own university for not considering that at the moment, but I think there might be some personnel changes in the next couple of years that might make that more possible. I think Monash has announced a zero carbon footprint and a divestment strategy. Don't quote me on that. So yes, absolutely, universities should be leading all sorts of things, but this one in particular.
I just wanted to find out, we touched a lot of sort of subjects on the general public, but I think the important part is to make our politicians hear. And I think, we are always at a loss. How can, we write to the Prime Minister, we write to the Liberal Party, we hardly get a personalised sort of answer. But how can we make them act on our concerns? That's my biggest concern. Like for example, what I really liked is actually in the marriage equality debate, somebody put this bike and sort of knitted around it outside Turnbull's home, and that ended up in Facebook and was a very positive message, and I think he acted kind of on it. So what can we do that is maybe not threatening for them and positive, but leads them to action to say we want, the carbon tax?
Well, there's no single answer to that question. There really isn't. If there was somebody and it was easy, somebody would have done it. Look, I think you have a vote. It's a powerful thing. You have money invested in superannuation or in a bank. That's another powerful thing. You have a local member. If I often say that there's actually three things people could do with virtually no money to make a difference. You ring your local or email your local member and say, I'm only going to vote for you if you have a decent climate policy, number one. You ring your local bank and your local superannuation company and say, I do not want my investment in fossil fuels and I will change my fund or my bank accordingly, and lots of people have done that. And the other thing is to not feel that it's all you yourself. I mean, I think coming together in community action groups is very powerful. So let me give you just one example, because a lot of people say, I'm really frustrated, I'm really concerned, what can I do as an individual? So the example I use is my colleague Amanda McKenzie. Now Amanda is the CEO of the Climate Council now. She was the communications director of the Climate Commission, that's how I met her. Amanda, when she was quite young, I'd say 18, 20, whenever it was that Tim Flannery's book The Weathermakers came out, she read that. It inspired her. She started with her sister, just going to local schools and giving talks and that sort of thing. And then eventually, together with another very, very smart and inspiring woman, Anna Rose, who some of you might remember from the documentary she did with Nick Minchin called Madlands. Amanda and Anna started the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. There were two of them that started that. And there are now over 130,000 members. And those members, you get kicked out when you turn 30, so it is a youth organisation. So they got kicked out eventually. Though that organisation has been extraordinarily effective. They will turn up at the headquarters of a bank and do a flash mob dance in the foyer until they're allowed to see the chief executive, etc., etc. They've got very creative ways of going about things. So to me, that is just an extraordinary example of what one or two passionate, and they are the most passionate, dedicated people I've ever met, can actually do by being smart, being good communicators, harnessing the similar feelings of other people into a group. It's very difficult to do it on your own. So the third thing, which also doesn't cost anything, is to join a like-minded group that are doing effective things. And keep talking to politicians. Look, you know, I'm not telling anybody who to vote for, but you know, there are clear differences between our major political parties in terms of the potential effectiveness of their climate policy. For me, climate policy is the number one thing that determines my vote. And if more people felt like that, we would have a pretty rapid change in climate policy. That's notwithstanding all sorts of other things that are important to vote about. But if that's your number one thing, because for my kids, that's the number one thing that's going to affect their lives, then maybe we'll get somewhere.
More questions? Okay. So let's thank Lesley for a really great talk.
Thank you very much.